Welcome to the magic of podcasting. So I'm going to be talking to you today about how you can use podcasting to make meaningful connections and attract clients. Hi, I'm Angelina Antonio. I'm the founder of Travel Not to Escape and the host of the Travel Not to Escape podcast. I can work this. Okay. So imagine you are wanting to travel the world. I know, really hard to imagine in a digital nomad conference. But you're wanting to travel the world, create location freedom, time freedom, financial freedom, and you're stuck in a corporate job. So you take this leap of faith, you line everything up, you're hopeful, you're curious. This is where I was when I was taking this leap of faith. And I wasn't necessarily thinking of the worst case scenarios, but in a conference such as this, it's important that we talk about all parts of the entrepreneurship journey. So, reality check. A year later, after taking my leap of faith, I had tried everything. I was curious, I was open, I had so many shiny objects, and all of it, I realized, wasn't necessarily a business that I wanted to build. So that wrapped me into a bit of depression come January of 2024. And I realized that all the shiny objects that I pursued weren't necessarily things I wanted to continue doing. So I took a step back to reevaluate. But in that step back, my bank account was also dwindling and I had no source of income and again, spiraling. So I was in Asia at this time and decided, okay, let me go to, so I'm from the US originally, and my family has a house in the Philippines. So I was already in Asia. I decided to settle down there for a few months while I figured things out. And that's really, as I did that though, I realized that I was facing a lot of the fears that I wanted to, I didn't realize how to work through all those fears, those rejections, and it basically got me to a really low point by January 2024 where I had no idea what I was doing and I was questioning the decisions that I made. So my journey started actually focusing on neuroscience, cognitive science, and global public health. So my background was in healthcare consulting, and I climbed the corporate ladder for 10 years working in healthcare operations. And the 2020 came along and I got the opportunity, as many did, to be able to work remotely, which I took. And the thing that I realized was, as you take your laptop around the world with you, the problems, the burnout, things that you're not happy with in your life, they just travel with you. They don't change with the location. So that's what happened in 2020. I became a digital nomad and realized, oh, I still don't like the job. So I switched jobs and went into biotech SaaS. Again, took my laptop around the world and realized that's also not it. So I fully burned out and decided, okay, let's just start something completely fresh. I had all of these creative ideas that I wanted to pursue, and I figured, okay, now is the time to finally do it. So as many entrepreneurs who start their journey, they have a lot of shiny objects. So Rika, you mentioned multi-passionate. That's definitely how I started. So I started off writing a ghost story cookbook. You can ask me about this later. Create a card game. I also did tarot readings for a little bit. Created my own guided journal, my own children's book line. I hosted play events and workshops around the world. Started a course, membership, coaching. I did travel content creation for a hot second, and then the podcast at the end. So multi-passionate, a lot of shiny objects. And at this point, at the end of 2023, I realized, as I mentioned, I didn't necessarily want to build a full business around any of these things. That's how I got to my rock bottom in the Philippines. And at that point, because it was in a smaller city in the Philippines as well, I didn't necessarily have the same connections that I had traveling to these digital nomad hubs. It was me, my special needs brother, and his caregiver as the only people that I saw in person for 6 months. So podcasting really was the only thing that was my lifeline during this period of time. It was the only shiny object that was actually the light at the end of this tunnel. And as I leaned into podcasting a little bit more, I realized that the true power was actually in the connections I was making. And at some points I did want to quit. I was tired, editing was really difficult sometimes. Each episode takes around 8 hours to film, edit, source, etc. But the more that I continued doing it, the more that I realized I was getting inspired by the people whose stories I was sharing. So as I was wanting to quit at some moments, I realized I would get contacted by someone who wanted to be a guest and share their story. Or someone out of the blue would reach out to me and say that because they listened to some episodes, they ended up changing their lives and pivoted and took the leaps themselves. Like one, I remember a person reached out to me and said she was so inspired by listening to a few episodes, she ended up quitting her job and going to India to start her own fashion label. So stories like this really kept me going. And so the other part of podcasting that's really beneficial is with social media, it takes a lot of time to build the following, it takes a lot of consistency. Same thing with podcasting, but the level, the threshold is much lower. So my journey now, a year later, just in 1 year, as I mentioned, I have continued the podcast. It actually now is at over 70 guests that I've interviewed. Listeners are coming in from over 75 different countries. It is also, it was nominated by TVEX as one of the best travel podcasts last year. I've pivoted it into opportunities like speaking internationally. And although there are still lots of shiny objects, they are more focused now. They're focused on travel and mental health because I realized through my experiences in my own mental health journey that I could help support others. So the podcast is actually now turning into a media platform, and with that, creating this go-to mental health resource for travelers. As part of that, my main service is actually business consulting for therapy and mental health practices, and I also facilitate mental health support meetups in partnership with those mental health experts to be able to bring travelers in community, talk about some of these subjects that we don't necessarily always talk about in normal conversations, and with the support of someone who has led and studied and is credentialed in this area. And also the thing that I'm working on now is the Travel Mental Health Summit. So it'll be virtual, but it'll be able to provide workshops and resources from different mental health experts to travelers. So stay tuned for that. So all of this because of podcasting. So let's do a little interaction. Who here has thought about starting a podcast? Okay, who has actually started a podcast? Perfect, so it's like half and half. So some of the things that might have been preventing you from starting this podcast are some of these podcasting myths. It's too late to start a podcast. You need expensive equipment in order to start. You need a huge audience to make money, or you need to have it all figured out before you get started. And all of these are in fact myths. So let's take a look at some truths. You've probably seen this stat, but it deserves to be said that 90% of podcasts don't actually make it to episode 3. So if you're one of the few that keep going to episode 21, you're actually in the top 1% of podcasts. I told you that bar was actually pretty low. So that's just 20,000 podcasts. And with that, there's so many different subjects. So in your particular niche, you can become a thought leader just by consistency. And also, it's just the market projections. Podcasting is going to be worth $17.6 billion by 2030. Engagement is really high, and it's going to continue to grow, so it's not too late to start. So how do you start? I know a lot of people have blockers. So one of the ways that I got started was just as a listener. And there's ways that you can do this as a listener, to turn into a guest, to turn into a host. But this process is actually pretty cyclical because as you're a host, then you get guests, and then you also get listeners, really, so they're all very interconnected. But let's start with listener. These are actually the podcasts that I listen to at some of my lowest moments. And I listened to these specific podcasts because I wanted to brainwash myself. All those limiting beliefs, those negative thoughts and self-doubts that I had were too consuming at that point when I was at my low. So I needed something to infiltrate that, and so podcasts were a really great way to brainwash myself into thinking of all the other possibilities. So use it as a way to brainwash yourself, and specifically find the podcast where they're featuring people that have your similar identity and experience, so that if they're just a couple steps ahead of you, it makes it even more attainable. And if you don't know where to start, just be curious. So if anyone is trying to take a leap of faith, starting their own business, and they have no idea where to start, podcast is really great to be able to get ideas and inspiration. Okay, so guesting. Taking the next level to be a podcast guest. So this is an actual how-to. How do you become a guest? So I've been on over 50 podcasts at this point, so I kind of have it down to a strategy. But being a guest helps you build credibility. It helps you connect with others. Also allows you to understand what part of your story is going to be the most resonating to the audience. And you can tap into already built audiences from this podcast. Just some of the podcasts that I've been on that I wanted to highlight. So the very first podcast that I was actually on was back in 2022, I believe, and it was a Solo Female Traveler podcast. And because of that, she had interviewed me and asked me, what do you want this episode to be titled? We were talking about traveling as a form of distraction. And this quote came up in my head. We travel not to escape life, but for life not to escape us. And so that's how the name of my podcast was actually born. Travel not to escape. It came because of the podcast that it was on. A couple ones that I wanted to highlight as well. Maverick Show, he has been podcasting for the last 10 years. Being on his show actually ended up connecting me with a few other podcast hosts and my first podcast sponsor. Being on the Bougie and Backpack podcast, I ended up speaking at their summit 6 times, so that's pivoted into speaking positions. Jet Set Journeys, that podcast, even though I was only the 3rd person that he had interviewed, ended up getting me my first therapy client. And then that allowed me to then be on therapy podcasts, so You Need a Counselor podcast, giving me more credibility in the space. So how do you become a guest? I don't know if a lot of people know, but Facebook groups for podcasting is actually really big. And so if you want to be a guest, you can find a ton of these podcast collaboration groups. These are ones that I'm personally in, where people actually look for guests all the time. So if you don't know where to start or don't even really know what your topic is, check out Facebook. People are posting all the time for guests. You can also direct message podcasts on Instagram. That's a great way that I've been able to get in touch with people, because they're actually, the hosts are the ones checking the Instagrams for the most part. Each podcast also has a website, so you can submit your information and your pitch on their websites. There's also AI podcasting software. I don't necessarily recommend those as much because the pitches they do sound very AI. Or you can hire a podcast agent for pretty cheap as well. Some tips if you're going to become a guest: it's going to be good to create a speaker one-page bio. So this will be your headshot. This is going to have a list of topics that you can talk about, as well as questions that the host can ask you. Personally, I have a Google Doc that I have a short and a long form of my bio, as well as pre-approved photos. So anytime that I do pitch to be on a podcast, I already have all the information ready. One lead magnet. I think a lot of people forget about this, but only have one. If you're going to be promoting something on a podcast, like a lot of people that are authors will promote just their one book that's going to be out. So as you're going to be on a podcast, make sure you're promoting just the one thing that you want people that are listening to really click on and tune into. Also, if you have a website, being on different podcasts will actually elevate your site SEO, because you're getting listed on their podcast websites, as well as Spotify, YouTube, all the ways that they are actually going to be posting the podcast also. And then as a guest, promote the show, rate and review, because that actually helps the algorithm as well. Okay, the other tip too is create a podcast guest playlist, because as you go on a lot more podcasts, it's going to be beneficial for you to put them all together, so that if any future podcast hosts want to understand what questions to ask you, or if you're pitching yourself for additional speaker opportunities, you can create a Spotify playlist, a YouTube playlist, an Apple playlist, so that it's very easy for you to organize all of your podcast guest appearances. That's a lot. Hopefully that was helpful. As a host, so being a guest is really powerful. It allows you to reach your target market and also take advantage of the podcast audience that's already there. Same thing goes for hosting. But with this, you have more intimate connections because you're the one who is driving the conversation. You're the one who can choose the topics and the guests that you want on your show so that it aligns with your business model. Specifically for my podcast, I record an hour and a half. So every time someone connects with me, we do an hour and a half call block, even though the podcast itself is only an hour, because I like to use the time before and after to make those connections. And then for each guest, I actually ask them for 1 to 3 other potential guests within their network that they would refer to me so that I'm expanding my network with every person that I have on. And then again, choosing guest topics that connect with your business model, we'll go over that in a second. So, as I mentioned, podcasting has so many different opportunities, specifically if you're wanting to pivot into speaking, events, collaborations, and ultimately partnerships. This is just an example of one that I did recently in January. So, I interviewed Delphine last year, and she invited me to speak as part of her community, She Base, which is a female entrepreneur mastermind group. So then from there, we ended up co-hosting an event in person at the Chiang Mai Nomad Summit, which led to me speaking at that same summit, all because I interviewed her last year. So you never know how these connections will actually end up helping you in your career. Additional opportunities. Again, podcasting has led to so many random things that the dots connect later. As I mentioned, Matt ended up referring me to Safety Wing, so they were my first podcast sponsor. I ended up having a host of other events that I was able to speak at because of the podcasting, Bougie and Backpack Summit, as well as being able to exhibit at Da Nang Vietnam's biggest international innovation and startup festival, where I ended up interviewing and being the media for their conference. And it's not just me. So this is actually pulled from a Facebook post where another podcaster asked, is everyone else having the same level of connections and collaborations through podcasting? And everyone else agreed that's the true magic of podcasting. Okay, now let's get into making money. So the tip of the iceberg is sponsorships and exclusivity licensing. So this is where you see a lot of the big podcasts making money, where they will list the ads in the mid-roll or the pre-roll, or they partner with XM or Spotify and then they get paid through that contract. But all the other ways that you can make money through podcasting is promoting your own events, affiliate links, premium subscriptions, live or online events, different products or courses, or your own coaching or consulting services. Those same podcasts that I listen to, I actually now listen to each of the podcasts and try to figure out what their business model is. So Susie actually ended up being my business coach after a while. She has courses, coaching, events, and retreats. Expanded for To Be Magnetic, they primarily have the course, membership, events, and ads. Matt's interesting because his podcast, he interviews digital nomad entrepreneurs, but his main business is real estate, turnkey properties. So as he's interviewing these entrepreneurs on like a very different topic, he's actually also being known for his real estate turnkey business once they have the profit and investment money ready. And then Diani, she hosts the While She's Away podcast, and her main service is podcast production. So she uses the podcast as her portfolio. Personally, I use mine as a lead magnet and a nurture sequence, and you can do this in the same way. If you're a coach, educator, if you're in software and tech, travel agency, you can use this as a way to promote destinations, and then people are so curious about those destinations, they want people to book or help booking those trips. And so you can be a travel agent with a podcast talking about different destinations. Or if you're in software and tech, you can have a podcast talking about user stories and tutorials and features. So you could really use podcasting in a lot of different ways. I will be very specific about how I use it. So as I mentioned, I position myself in the intersection of mental health and travel. So my particular guests are travelers, community builders, and therapists. So therapists are my target market because I do B2B services. Travelers are who the therapists want to reach out to. And community builders are another resource that I like to interview because they are the ones creating these communities around the world, so travelers have an idea of how they can make connections while they're traveling, but at the same time, the community builders have already created the communities that it can then tap into. So if you've tried to promote your services on Facebook, for example, and got deleted or banned because you were too spammy on self-promotion, podcasting is a better way to be able to interview that admin or the creator of that community and have them actually share your information, your podcast, on their listservs, on their newsletters, within their Facebook groups. So going in it as a collaborator rather than spamming. Also, my clients, as I mentioned, there's a few different business models I have going, but the main one being therapists buying business consulting services from me. And I also put them onto a therapist directory that I'm creating, and then the sponsorships come from the travel brands because of the travelers that I have as part of the listeners. So it's a bit of a dual marketplace, but the important part is positioning yourself so that you are in the intersection of like your clients and the listeners. And again, as I said, I wanted to be really specific. So I burned out with creating travel content. I was doing a lot of Instagram, working with brands, specifically on like physical products, and I got really tired of lugging a suitcase around at like 5 a.m. trying to take really pretty photos. And so I realized as I was building my business model, I didn't want to have to show up on Instagram all the time in order to actually promote or market myself. So I primarily do my marketing through Facebook groups for travelers, Facebook groups for therapists, mental health conferences or traveler conferences like this, and podcasts. So that's why I've been on a ton of podcasts, because my main model marketing is by tapping into existing communities. I also then, from the top, I get them into my system by interviewing the travelers as part of the podcast, inviting them to the Facebook community, or hosting mental health support meetups for free so that they are in the ecosystem and get a taste of the value. And then for the therapists, I invite them to the podcast directory or to co-host a workshop with me. And then ultimately that leads to new listeners and community members, or for the therapist, a discovery call so I can sell them my consulting services. But it becomes a lot more fluid because you're providing value up front rather than doing cold outreach when they don't even really know you. So this is an example of Susie's model. So for her as a coach, she's a business coach, and she has women who want to become location, financial, and time-free. And so those are her listeners. So in order to attract those listeners, she hosts women who are experts or coaches or already have changed their lives. And she also hosts people that want coaching services and a bit of a pointed question. So she'll answer one question on a recorded podcast, so that way her listeners can get a taste of her coaching. They're inspired by the other experts that are already on her podcast. And that's how she's able to sell courses, retreats, and her business coaching services. As I mentioned, Ziani does it as a portfolio. So she's able to sell podcast production services because she's built up a listenership of travelers, and with the listenership of travelers, she's also interviewing, so she's also selling sponsorships and travel content to travel brands because of her traveler base, and then podcast hosts that she hosts on the podcast, she can then pitch her podcast production services to. So this is how you can make money without a big following if you're connecting with the right people. But you also don't want to just connect with people on a podcast to only sell them. So I think it's really important that you use the time that you have with your podcast guests to actually make meaningful connections. So a few tips to make it less salesy during the process. Make sure you promote your guests. So they're going on, they're giving their story, they're sharing an hour and a half of their time least with you. So make sure that you're promoting them through your different newsletters, social media, so that they're seen also as a thought leader. I mentioned I asked for 1 to 3 contacts in their network. I also have a signature question. I always ask everyone what your favorite childhood activity was, because my podcast is also based on play. So this question actually opens up a lot of people and really allows them to dive in deep right from the onset. I also have repeat questions that I ask for every guest, so that at the end I can do a compilation and have like 30 people in this industry that I've interviewed, for example, that have answered this particular question. And then connect with guests before and after, and speak their name in the rooms that they're not in, which is why I shared specifically the podcast that I was on and the ones that have helped me as well. So, we got to the end. And with the future of work as remote workers, we don't necessarily have the same structures in place to be able to network, so we have to create those same networking opportunities for ourselves. So podcasting has been the way that I've been able to use for my business, and hopefully after this talk, it is also a possibility for you. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Julie.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk. Actually, I do podcasting myself, as you know. I've been on a podcast,
Yes.
and I'm doing yours, and it's great. I absolutely love that. My question predominantly is around the engagement of listeners on the podcast. What I've noticed in my analytics is generally after 20 minutes, they start dropping off. Is this something that you've seen in your, as a creator of podcasts, and how do you keep it engaged? And if so, what is the optimal length for a podcast?
Yeah, I've seen that as well. It does drop off midway through. My episodes are 45 minutes to an hour. But as I mentioned, for me, I guess the engagement isn't as necessary in my business model, because I'm more targeting the guests in terms of my monetization. But the engagement is important if I was targeting sponsorships and ads, for example. But in order to keep it engaging, there are a couple of things that you could do. You could shorten your episodes. I like to keep mine at 45 minutes to an hour. I find that that's like the ideal way to be able to get someone's deep story out of it. You could also break things apart. I know I've seen some people do like mid-roll breaks throughout their podcast and keep things interesting, or have like a hook, or they start off with like the big reveal in the very beginning that you don't reveal until the end. So there's a lot of different tactics, but ask yourself whether it matters for the purpose of your podcasting.
Thank you so much for sharing all those informations. I was really curious about how you build rapport with your guests. Do you meet them twice? Do you meet them only once, and then you start recording after 15 minutes? How is your process, and why does it work for you?
Yes, I think it works because of the actual time that I'm recording with them. We go really deep. They've mentioned, even the therapists are like, I felt like I just got out of therapy. But the process itself is very automated. So if I have a guest coming on, I will send them my calendar link with specific questions, and then they book right away onto my calendar. So I don't necessarily do a prep time with them unless they're the ones that have cold pitched me. So if they cold pitched me, then I'll do a 30-minute prep interview ahead of time before I even send them my calendar link. So it just depends on how they come into the ecosystem, I guess. But again, having a signature question that opens them up right away really helps. And the buffer time that I have, 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after each of the recording episodes, is like a really precious time to get to know someone.
Okay, you never shared your 15 minutes before, 15 minutes after, because you find some gold mines in it?
That part is really just tech check. So a lot of it is just getting them warmed up and seeing like what they've been up to, where they're located, how they're feeling. So it's just a bit of a casual prep before we dive into the actual episode. But because I asked them what their favorite childhood activity is, that brings them back to a really happy place, and that kind of pivots into childhood traumas or like happy things, depending on what we're talking about.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Last question.
Yeah, so actually myself and Joanna recently started a podcast called the Nomad Storybook. I'm curious, kind of building on the question you just had in terms of preparing a guest for the podcast. We kind of have an idea for what the episode looks like before we record it. We kind of make a structure and so on. But then we find that as you allow the guest to open up, the conversation deviates from what you initially expect. I'm just wondering how you find structuring versus letting a conversation kind of run a natural course, and how you know what I mean, build the episode around that.
Yeah, so I have my opening question, and then I have my closing questions. And then in between, I have maybe 5 to 10 questions that I'll ask. And I do let them run through and share their story, because I find that that's actually the best way to connect and have them be vulnerable and open up, and that's the best part of the interview. But with those like 5 to 10 questions I have, I know when to bring them back in. So it is a constant, like, this is the line of where you want them to be, and they're like up here. So I'm constantly moving them back down. And most times it works, but I think that's also why I have an hour for that block, so I can edit out anything that might be a little too long.
Okay, thank you very much. I also just quickly wanted to ask, when you are finishing and kind of ready to publish an episode, do you typically send it to the guest and ask for approvals and permission, or do you?
It depends on the guest. Yeah, so some guests who've been on like hundreds of podcasts, they don't need to see it. But others who, I find the ones that have not been on podcasts ahead of time, like this, like the first or second or third, they're the ones that are like, I want to listen to it, I want to see all the marketing materials, I want to copy, like it's like a bigger deal. Like, when is it going to be out? Yeah, so it depends on the guest and how much they're asking. But typically, no, but now I'm moving towards yes, just to eliminate some of the back and forth.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, that answers. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.